How's it going, guys? We are back for another video on the K24 FRS swap series. If you guys have been following these videos, you'll know that I am swapping a K24 with a CD09 transmission into my Scion FRS. But that's kind of the broad overview of the major parts being used in this swap. So for today's video, I wanted to talk about the minor and more specific parts that I'm using to make this whole setup run. In addition to that, at the end of the video, I'm also going to talk about the steps that still need to be done, when you guys can expect to see this car running, and when you guys can expect to see it on the track, because I do feel like I have a pretty realistic and accurate timeline of when those things will take place. So stay tuned till the end of the video, but for now, let's talk about the specific parts to make my car run. So for this video, I'm going to stick pretty strictly to the parts that are in the drivetrain, not necessarily the parts that are the aero of the car or the interior of the car. We can save that for another video. We're really just going to focus on what's inside the engine bay and what's going on with the transmission. So starting with the engine, it is a built motor with a ported and polished head. As far as the block itself, we've got JE pistons that are 12.5 to 1 compression. We've got Sands S series connecting rods, ARP head studs, 4-piston RR4 camshafts. We've got a 4-piston K-series oil pump, 4-piston K-series adjustable cam gear, and the 50-degree VTC gear. We've also got a SuperTech valve spring kit to top off the head, and I'm hoping that this setup is going to make close to about 300 horsepower naturally aspirated. Now, kind of moving from the top of the motor down to the bottom, we have the K-Power valve cover. Now, the reason that we went with a K-Power valve cover instead of a normal valve cover is because for anybody familiar with this swap, you'll see that the breather port that's normally on the motor, which comes out about here, is very close to the firewall and basically makes it impossible, or at least very difficult, to put a hose on. So the K-Power valve cover puts that breather right here and makes it a lot easier to put something on. So that is really nice for this FRS swap, or basically any rear-wheel drive K24 swap. We've also got NGK coil packs and spark plugs below that. So moving to the back of the motor, we have a track tough rear-wheel drive swirl pot. Essentially what this does is it feeds the coolant from the back of the motor into the swirl pot, which is almost constantly bleeding the coolant system by getting the air out of it, and then feeds that coolant back into the radiator. Now, because this was the setup that I wanted to do with the radiator hose moving right here, we couldn't do the EP3 tensioner pulley kit, which would have another pulley kind of right about here, because obviously that would interfere with where the hose is running. So instead, we're using this K-Power pulley kit, which basically removes the tensioner. And instead of using a tensioner, you push the alternator out using spacers in order to create tension on the pulley in the serpentine belt. I'm not in love with this setup, if I'm being completely honest, because I don't like the fact that there's not a tensioner in the equation. Obviously, I knew that when I bought this kit that that's how it worked, but the fact that you have to figure out how many spacers you want to use in order to create tension on this belt, and the fact that if this belt gets any looser over time, it's going to obviously not create additional tension that a tensioner might do. It's not my favorite setup, but for now, this is what we're going to run. If you'll notice, I don't have normal spacers. I have these kind of plastic spacers, and the reason for that is because the spacers that came with the K-Power kit were not enough to space the alternator to create adequate tension. So I use these plastic spacers, and then I have metal versions of these spacers currently being shipped to me. So I'm going to replace these plastic ones with metal ones eventually that hopefully will be strong enough to hold this entire setup for a long period of time. And then as far as the rest of the things on the front of the motor, we do have an ATI super damper. This essentially is a harmonic balancer, which makes sure that the crankshaft is balanced while it spins, instead of the normal kind of this style pulley, which doesn't really do a lot. This will help make sure that the engine is balanced, which will help keep it reliable. We also have a Bosch oil pressure and temperature sensor. This allows the normal oil pressure temperature port to now be converted to oil temp and oil pressure. So that's pretty neat. So next, you can kind of see it down there, but I have the K-Power engine mounts as well as the K-Power oil pan. Let's talk about the intake manifold for a second. It is a K-Power rear-wheel drive manifold. It's basically the best rear-wheel drive manifold from how I understand for a K swap. Everybody runs it essentially on almost all rear-wheel drive K setups. We also have a Bosch 74mm throttle body. That's not the normal setup for the K-Power swap, but I wanted one that increased the airflow instead of the standard FRS throttle body, which is used normally on the swap kit. Then we have Injector Dynamics 1050X injectors with a radium fuel rail. If you're interested in the Track Tough Swirl Pot that I noted before, I just want to kind of let you guys know that in order to make it work, you do have to have this little bung welded onto the back of the K-Power manifold in order to mount the Swirl Pot onto it to make sure it's stable. So just a heads up, if you do want that Swirl Pot, this is something that you will have to do. So this is what the setup looks like with the intake manifold on. You can see the Track Tough Swirl Pot in the back mounted to the intake manifold. And then I'm also going to have the K-Power intake, which kind of brings it around here, but obviously it's not in the car right now. All right, now let's talk about the jumble of different parts we have over here, starting with the starter. So this starter is a Carwood Bryce K series starter. I had to have it shipped from Britain, so that's kind of the only real way to get it. Now, the reason that I got it is because it doesn't have a conventional cone at the top of the starter. Let me grab the OEM starter and show you guys what I'm talking about. So this is an OEM starter, and as you'll notice, the top of it has this cone shape. So the problem with this cone shape is that when it's put into this setup, it directly makes contact with the transmission bell housing. So there's kind of two ways to go about it. The easy, I guess you could call it the easy way, or the cheap way, let's say, is to cut the transmission bell housing so where the cone makes contact just kind of sticks out of the bell housing. I wasn't in love with that idea. I didn't like the idea of having that opening. You could possibly maybe weld like a thin sheet metal over it so that there's not an opening, but either way, I just wasn't a huge fan of that idea. So this Carwood Bryce starter does not have that cone. Essentially, it just has the gear in there, and that's where it ends, so it doesn't make contact with anything. In addition to that, it is lighter than the OEM starter and supposedly stronger. The downside, obviously, is that it is significantly more sensitive than a normal starter, but you know, I'm already blowing out my bank account, so I might as well just keep going with that trend. Moving on, one other thing that I want to note regarding this Track Tough Swirl Pot, you may notice that this is not the OEM clutch master cylinder. This is a lot smaller, or at least like thinner than the OEM clutch master cylinder. And that's because if you use the OEM clutch master cylinder, it makes contact with this swirl pot. So you have to use something smaller in order to not make contact and just have this all be smooth. So conveniently, the Nissan Maxima, the clutch master cylinder, it fits perfectly into the OEM, the rest of the master cylinder, and it doesn't obviously make contact with the swirl pot. So that was a very, very convenient find. Full credit, I did not figure that out. Somebody else figured it out on the forums. I'll put his name in the corner as well to give him credit, but that is a super convenient fix. So now moving on, the swirl pot needs a coolant overflow, and it would have been very difficult to run that all the way to where the OEM overflow was. So basically, in order to make do, I bought this just a random coolant overflow off of eBay. It also is on Amazon. I'll put the link for it in the description, but it fits super conveniently in this little slot. And the reason that I say it fits conveniently is because if you look right here, there are these black little dots. Behind them, there are holes, which are perfectly sized for a M6 riv nut. So you don't have to drill anything. You can just put an M6 riv nut in there into both of those holes, and those happen to align perfectly with the holes that come on this coolant overflow. So I didn't have to do any drilling to mount this. I just had to put some riv nuts in those holes, and now we got a coolant overflow mounted really nicely. It also has this little indicator right here to show you how much coolant you have in there. So that's pretty neat. And I've got that obviously feeding up here to the swirl pot. So next you may have noticed this fancy little piece of carbon fiber. This is a Nuke Performance catch can. We've got that mounted with a bracket that I just made with some metal that I had around, mounted underneath the ABS unit right here. And it's mounted pretty securely. And we've just got some AN lines running to the breather port where the PCV was, as well as the breather line, which goes up here on top of the valve cover. So that's gonna catch any blow-by and make sure that we don't have any pressure building up inside the motor. It's really nice. It's pretty lightweight because it's made of carbon fiber, so that's pretty cool. Also, it looks really good. And it's got this nice little dipstick right here. I'll unscrew it for you guys. So you can see how much oil is inside there and if it's time to empty it. On the bottom, it has a drain port, and then right here, this white little cap is going to be replaced by a filter. But for now, I have it plugged so nothing gets in it during the whole build process. Now, as far as the things that you can't see, I'm gonna talk about the transmission. So as far as the throwout bearing, I'm using a Mick Load hydraulic throwout bearing. I have never used a hydraulic throwout bearing. I really don't know how this is gonna go, but I've currently got it set up with a little right angle coming out of the clutch master cylinder, and then it comes with this line right here. There's not contact right there, but it's very close to making contact. Not in love with that, but it's what we got. Hopefully the hydraulic throwout bearing provides more feel in the clutch pedal and just a more reliable throwout bearing experience, but we'll have to stay tuned to see what that's like. And then as far as the drive shaft, we've got a PST carbon fiber custom drive shaft. I measured the length because obviously the CDO9 for this setup is not the standard setup, so I had to mount the CDO9 in there and get some measurements, and then they made a drive shaft for me and it looks excellent. And lastly, I guess I should note the fueling system. So I do have a fuel cell, and with a return line that feeds into this fuel pressure regulator. Right here I have a flex fuel sensor, and then we've got some AN lines that'll feed to the radium fuel rail. Now some of you may have noticed that I don't have the battery here, and I also don't have the wiring harness that normally goes into the car right there. I'm not gonna talk about the plans for that just yet. You guys will just have to stay tuned for what the plan is for the exhaust and everything going on in that corner. So that's basically it for the setup. My goals with this setup is basically good power, but reliable. I really want it to be reliable and lightweight. I want it to be a track weapon that I can rely on, that I can go to the track like every 2 weeks or once a month and not really have to worry about any reliability issues like I did with the Turbo FA20. And obviously lightweight, because I think that I honestly prefer a lighter car that's more fun in my opinion than a car that's heavier but with more power. So trying to keep the weight down was a huge priority with this. And I think that the way that we got the setup, I think that the weight reduction and keeping the weight down goal has been met. As far as what still needs to be done, the exhaust still needs to be built because I am going with the custom exhaust setup, and then some wiring needs to be done. I'm using a Motec M150 ECU, so we're gonna need a new update done to that ECU as well as some minor wiring because I really do not like wiring. So that's one of the things I'm going to outsource, but basically just some minor wiring in the exhaust and the car will be ready to start. I'm thinking that we're probably going to be able to start the car, I'd say mid to late April, because I've got an appointment to get the exhaust built in mid-March, so that kind of puts the timeline for like mid to late April for when we'll start the car. And then it kind of depends on if there's going to be any problems at that point, like if there's anything that we need to redo, any red flags that appear after we start the car. But if everything goes smooth, I'm really hoping that we will have this thing on track by summer 2022. So that's basically going to do it for this video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, or you guys can message me on Instagram at narrowman98. I also have been having some fun with TikTok, just kind of making some memes. So my TikTok is also narrowman98 if you want to see some memes. But that's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a good one.